December 14th, 1944. 0400 hours, 70 miles east of Luzon. Lieutenant Commander William Turner Caldwell stood on the rain-slicked flight deck of USS Independence, watching his night fighters prepare for a mission that defied every rule the Navy had written about carrier operations. Around him, deck crews worked in near-total darkness, guided only by dim red flashlights that wouldn't destroy their night vision. The 27-year-old pilot from Tennessee had trained for 18 months to fly an F6F Hellcat in conditions no sane aviator would choose. Tonight, he'd launched 2 hours before sunrise to hunt Japanese aircraft over airfields the enemy believed were safe until daylight. The mission violated everything. Carrier doctrine promised would kill you, launch in darkness, navigate by instruments alone across 80 miles of ocean, find enemy airfields before dawn, attack during the twilight when visibility meant death for the defender but life for the attacker. Return to a carrier deck you couldn't see except for 2 white posts marking the arresting cables. 3 weeks earlier, Japanese night raiders had destroyed 11 B-29 superfortresses on Saipan, killing 45 Americans and wounding 200 more. The raids came at dusk and dawn, when American fighters were either secured for the night or not yet airborne. The Japanese pilots had learned a terrible lesson. There existed a defensive gap, a window of vulnerability that traditional carrier operations could never close, until Independence changed the rules. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Caldwell climbed into his Hellcat's cockpit, feeling the familiar weight of 35 pounds of flight gear pressing against his shoulders. His radar operator, Lieutenant Junior Grade Philip Morrison from Michigan, settled into the turret, a gunner's position behind him, monitoring the experimental AN/APS-6 radar that could detect enemy aircraft from 5 miles away in total darkness. The installation had been crude, almost desperate. Navy technicians had mounted the radar's antenna in a pod under the Hellcat's starboard wing, running cables through holes drilled in the aircraft's aluminum skin. The radar scope sat on Morrison's lap, its green phosphor screen showing a sweep line that would hopefully reveal enemy aircraft as bright blips against empty sky. Independence herself was a compromise, a light carrier built on a cruiser hull when America desperately needed flight decks faster than Essex-class construction could provide. At 573 feet long and displacing 11,000 tons, she carried 33 aircraft compared to the 90 aboard fleet carriers like Essex. But tonight, her smaller size meant agility. Her experimental night air group meant capability no other carrier possessed. Caldwell's entire squadron, Night Fighting Squadron 41, consisted of pilots who'd spent 29 weeks learning skills the pre-war Navy never imagined teaching. Night carrier landings, instrument navigation, radar intercept procedures, formation flying in total darkness, combat at altitudes where oxygen masks froze and instrument panels were the only reality. The Japanese believed carriers couldn't operate at night. Their own Kido Butai doctrine emphasized massed daytime strikes. Their carrier pilots trained exclusively for visual combat. They'd watched American task forces retire at sunset, secure in the knowledge that darkness meant safety, that airfields could be used freely during the hours when carrier-based fighters posed no threat. They were about to discover how wrong that assumption had become. At 0430 hours, Independence turned into the wind. Caldwell felt the carrier accelerate, heard the pitch of her turbines change as steam flowed into machinery spaces. Below, flight deck officers in dim red vests gestured with glowing wands, guiding his Hellcat toward the port catapult. The catapult officer raised his wand, circled it twice, then pointed forward. Caldwell pushed his throttle to full power. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine roared, 18 cylinders producing 2,000 horsepower that made the entire aircraft shake. He felt the catapult's tremendous force, acceleration that pressed him back into his seat with crushing weight, then sudden release as his Hellcat shot off the deck into darkness. For 3 seconds he flew blind, trusting instruments alone while his eyes adjusted to the void. Airspeed indicator climbing, altitude rising, artificial horizon showing wings level. Then his night vision returned and he saw nothing, absolutely nothing, except stars above and darkness below where ocean met sky in invisible merger. Behind him, Morrison's voice came through the intercom, radar contact on the task force. Bearing 090, range 4 miles. We're good for navigation. Caldwell banked right, falling into formation with 3 other Hellcats launching at 30-second intervals. They climbed to 8,000 feet, maintaining strict radio silence while flying west toward the Philippines. Below them, Task Force 38 continued its approach toward Luzon, 12 carriers and 60 supporting ships moving through darkness at 25 knots. The task force had sortied from Ulithi 3 weeks earlier for what everyone believed would be another series of daylight strikes supporting MacArthur's invasion of Luzon. But Vice Admiral John McCain, commander of Task Force 38, had studied intelligence reports about Japanese night raids with growing fury. American B-29s cost $600,000 each. Trained bomber crews required 18 months of preparation. Losing them on the ground to enemy aircraft operating during gaps in fighter coverage was unacceptable. McCain had requested Independence's night air group specifically for this operation. The light carrier would operate independently from the main task force, providing continuous coverage during the hours when traditional carrier aviation fell silent. Her night fighters would patrol over Japanese airfields from dusk until dawn, preventing enemy aircraft from launching. Her night search aircraft would locate Japanese ships attempting to move under cover of darkness. Most importantly, her pre-dawn strikes would catch enemy aircraft on the ground when they believed themselves safe. The concept was revolutionary, terrifying, and absolutely necessary, because the mathematics of Pacific Island combat had shifted dramatically since Guadalcanal. America now operated B-29s from the Marianas, attacking Japan itself with strategic bombing campaigns that required protection across thousands of miles of ocean. Japanese night raiders flying from the Philippines and Formosa could reach those bases, destroy the bombers, and return before American fighters could respond. Unless those fighters learned to own the darkness. At 05:45 hours, Caldwell's formation reached Luzon. Morrison hunched over his radar scope, watching for aircraft taking off or landing. The Japanese had 17 major airfields on the island, each capable of launching 50 to 80 aircraft. Intelligence estimated 300 Japanese planes currently based there, a mixture of Zero fighters, Betty bombers, and Francis attack aircraft. At dawn, those aircraft would launch against Task Force 38. American ships would face waves of coordinated attacks, kamikazes loaded with 500-pound bombs seeking carriers. The traditional defense involved combat air patrols launched at first light, intercepting Japanese formations after they'd already taken off, already achieved altitude, already organized into attack groups. Caldwell's mission changed that equation. Catch them on the ground. Destroy them before they could become organized threats. Turn Japanese airfields into death traps during the twilight hours when visibility favored attackers who knew exactly where targets sat. Morrison's voice cut through his thoughts. Contact. Bearing 270, Angels 12, range 30 miles. Multiple targets, count 4, possibly 5 aircraft. Caldwell pushed his throttle forward. His Hellcat accelerated to 250 miles per hour, the maximum speed at which Morrison could maintain radar lock. The other 3 fighters in his division spread into combat formation, each separated by 500 yards, to provide mutual support while maintaining radar coverage. The Japanese aircraft were climbing from Clark Field, a massive complex northwest of Manila that housed the remnants of the 4th Air Army. They were night fighters themselves, older Zeros modified with searchlights and primitive air-to-air tactics designed to intercept B-29s. Their pilots expected to hunt bombers, slow targets following predictable routes. They'd never imagined encountering American fighters at night. Caldwell closed to 2 miles before Morrison called out, "Visual range." Caldwell switched his gun sight from instrument mode to combat mode, watched the illuminated reticle appear on his windscreen. The Japanese aircraft appeared as dark shapes against slightly less dark sky, their exhaust flames glowing orange in the pre-dawn gloom. He selected the nearest target, centered his gun sight, and opened fire. 6 50-caliber machine guns erupted, tracers arcing out in brilliant streams that seemed to bend through space before striking the Japanese fighter. The Zero exploded instantly, its fuel tanks igniting in a fireball that lit the sky for 3 seconds before plummeting toward Earth 20,000 feet below. The other Japanese fighters scattered, diving for cloud cover that didn't exist in the clear tropical night. Caldwell's wingmen engaged them methodically, using radar guidance to track targets their eyes couldn't follow. Within 90 seconds, 4 Japanese aircraft burned, falling toward the Philippine jungle in flaming arcs visible for 50 miles. The 5th Japanese pilot managed to escape, diving for the deck where ground clutter confused American radar. But his survival meant nothing. His radio transmission warning Clark Field about American night fighters arrived too late to change what happened next. At 0600 hours, with the eastern horizon just beginning to lighten, Caldwell led his division in a low-level attack run over Clark Field. The Japanese had positioned their aircraft in revetments, concrete shelters designed to protect against high-altitude bombing, but those revetments were open-topped, vulnerable to attackers coming in at treetop altitude. Caldwell dove from 5,000 feet to 500 feet in 10 seconds, his Hellcat screaming down at 400 miles per hour. He triggered his guns at 800 yards, walked the tracers across a row of parked Betty bombers. His armor-piercing incendiary rounds tore through thin aluminum, ignited fuel lines, detonated ammunition. The field erupted. Explosions blossomed across the parking areas. Burning aircraft lit the dawn like massive bonfires. Japanese ground crews ran for cover as ammunition cooked off in secondary explosions that threw debris 500 feet into the air. Caldwell pulled up hard, 6 Gs crushing him into his seat as he climbed back to altitude. Behind him, his wingmen made their own attack runs, methodically destroying every aircraft they could reach. By 0615, 19 Japanese aircraft burned at Clark Field. Not a single American fighter had been damaged. Caldwell's formation turned east, racing the sunrise back to Independence. Dawn came quickly at 14 degrees north latitude, darkness surrendering to light in less than 30 minutes. They had to reach the carrier, land, refuel, and rearm before the main daytime strikes launched at 0700 hours. Morrison guided them back using radar bearings from the task force. At 50 miles out, Caldwell could see Independence's wake, a white line cutting through dark water. At 10 miles, he could distinguish her flight deck, lit now by white posts on either side marking the arresting cables. At 1 mile, he entered the landing pattern, dropping flaps and landing gear while bleeding off speed. The landing signal officer stood at the port quarter, illuminated paddles guiding Caldwell toward the deck. Cut. Caldwell chopped power. His Hellcat dropped the final 10 feet, tailhook catching the number 3 wire. Deceleration slammed him forward against his harness. Deck crews swarmed the aircraft, unhooking the wire, pushing the fighter toward the bow to clear space for the next landing. Caldwell climbed out on shaking legs, pulled off his helmet, and breathed air that tasted of salt and aviation fuel. Around him, Independence's flight deck erupted into controlled chaos as daytime strike aircraft moved into position for launch. SB-2C Helldiver dive bombers loaded with 1,000-pound bombs. TBM Avenger torpedo bombers carrying aircraft torpedoes and extra fuel tanks. F6F Hellcats, armed with high-velocity aircraft rockets and 500 rounds per gun. Commander Turner Caldwell walked toward the ready room, past crews who barely noticed him. The night fighters were a separate world, operating on a different schedule, fighting battles most aviators never witnessed. They launched in darkness, returned at dawn, and disappeared into their ready rooms while the main air groups flew conventional strikes. But their impact was undeniable. Every Japanese aircraft destroyed on the ground meant one less threat against the task force. Every night, patrol flown over enemy airfields meant Japanese bombers couldn't launch uncontested. Every pre-dawn strike at twilight meant catching the enemy at his most vulnerable moment. The Japanese had believed dawn provided safety, that the hours before sunrise belonged to them. They'd positioned their air forces to exploit that assumption, planning raids at first light, when American carriers were just beginning flight operations. They'd developed tactics around attacking during the gap between darkness and full daylight, when defensive fighters were either not yet launched or still forming up. Now that gap has closed, and 60 miles to the west, as the sun broke over the Philippine mountains, Japanese officers at 17 different airfields were counting their losses and realizing that the night no longer protected them. The rules had changed. American carriers could now project power 24 hours a day, and the twilight belonged to independence. December 15, 1944. Imperial Japanese Navy Air Base, Clark Field, Luzon. Commander Minoru Genda stood in the operations center staring at reports that made no tactical sense. 19 aircraft destroyed. 4 night fighters shot down before reaching altitude. American carrier-based fighters operating 2 hours before sunrise, attacking during the twilight when his airfields should have been safe. At 40 years old, Genda had helped plan the attack on Pearl Harbor, designed the tactical doctrine for Japan's carrier striking force, and understood naval aviation better than perhaps any officer in the Imperial Navy. He knew American carrier capabilities intimately, had studied their Essex-class specifications, their air group compositions, and their operational patterns. Everything he knew said carriers didn't operate at night. His intelligence officer, Lieutenant Commander Takeo Shibata, spread reconnaissance photographs across the table. These were taken at 0900 hours by a reconnaissance aircraft from Formosa, Task Force 38, operating 70 miles east of Luzon. 12 carriers visible, possibly more. But look at this one. Shibata pointed to a smaller carrier, distinct from the massive Essex-class fleet carriers dominating the formation. Independence-class light carrier, American designation CVL-22. We believe she's equipped with specialized night-fighting aircraft, radar-equipped Hellcats, trained crews, modified for darkness operations. Genda studied the photograph with growing concern. The Americans had solved a problem the Japanese Navy hadn't even recognized existed. Continuous air operations, no gaps in coverage, no safe hours when airfields could launch attacks without fighter opposition. The strategic implications were devastating. Japan's remaining air strength in the Philippines totaled approximately 600 aircraft, spread across 40 airfields. Those aircraft represented the Empire's final defensive line against MacArthur's invasion forces. But if American carriers could destroy them on the ground during dawn attacks, before they could organize defensive formations, then the mathematics of attrition became impossible. How many sorties can this light carrier sustain? Genda asked. Shibata consulted his notes. The estimated air group strength is 33 aircraft, perhaps 8 to 12 configured for night operations, but they're rotating continuously. Night patrols from 2200 to 0400 hours. Dawn strikes from 0400 to 0600. They never stop. Genda walked to the window overlooking Clark Field's main runway. Ground crews were still fighting fires from that morning's attack, pulling wrecked aircraft from their revetments, counting the dead. Beyond the immediate destruction, he could see the psychological damage in how his men moved, constantly scanning the sky, jumping at unexpected sounds. The Americans had weaponized the dawn, that liminal hour between darkness and daylight, when visibility improved rapidly but Japanese fighters weren't yet airborne, when American radar could track targets but Japanese eyes couldn't see attackers until too late. It was elegant, brutal, and completely effective. "We must change our operational schedule," Genda said quietly. "All aircraft will be dispersed before 0500 hours. Night fighters will maintain standing patrols from 0300 to 0700. We position anti-aircraft batteries with radar guidance to cover the dawn approach vectors." Shibata nodded, but his expression showed doubt. "Commander, our night fighter force consists of 12 aircraft. Zeros modified with searchlights. Their pilots have minimal instrument training. We're asking them to intercept radar-equipped American fighters in darkness." Genda understood mathematics. 12 Japanese aircraft against potentially 100 American night fighters across the entire Philippine theater. Zeros with crude modifications against purpose-built night fighters flown by pilots trained specifically for these conditions. It wasn't a fight. It was a massacre waiting to happen. But doing nothing meant accepting that every airfield in the Philippines was vulnerable for 2 hours every morning, that American carriers could attack with impunity during the gap between night and day, that Japan's air defense had a fatal blind spot the Americans would exploit until nothing remained. "Do it anyway," Genda ordered. "We adapt or we die." 800 miles northeast, aboard USS Enterprise off the coast of Formosa, Commander Edward Henry O'Hare's younger brother, Lieutenant Commander John O'Hare, studied reports from Independence's night operations with professional jealousy. Enterprise had pioneered night carrier operations earlier in the war, conducting experimental launches in 1943 that proved the concept's viability. Butch O'Hare had died during one of those early missions, killed by friendly fire while leading a night combat air patrol against Japanese Betty bombers. His death had nearly ended the Navy's night fighter program, commanders concluding the risks outweighed the benefits, but Independence had proven them wrong. Caldwell's unit was achieving kill ratios of 15-1, destroying Japanese aircraft on the ground before they could threaten the task force, providing coverage during hours when traditional carrier operations fell silent. The success couldn't be ignored. Enterprise's Air Group 90 was now training for night operations, converting 12 of their F6F Hellcats to night fighter configuration. The modification process took 6 weeks per aircraft, installing APS-6 radar, training pilots in instrument procedures, teaching landing signal officers to guide approaches in darkness. By March 1945, Enterprise would join Independence as a dedicated night carrier, operating independently from the main task force to provide 24-hour coverage. Eventually, Saratoga and Bonhomme Richard would follow, creating a night task group that the Japanese could never escape. But adaptation took time, and time meant casualties. Every night that American carriers remained vulnerable to Japanese twilight attacks, B-29s sat exposed on Saipan's airfields. Invasion forces loading onto transports risked raids they couldn't defend against. The Japanese were learning too. Intelligence reports showed enemy fighters repositioning before dawn, maintaining patrols during the gap hours, developing tactics specifically to counter American night operations. What began as a decisive advantage would become a brutal attritional fight as both sides evolved their doctrines. January 9, 1945. Task Force 38 entered the South China Sea through Bashi Channel, the narrow strait between Formosa and Luzon. The passage violated every principle of carrier operations, sailing into confined waters where land-based aircraft could attack from multiple directions, operating within range of Japanese airfields in the Philippines, Formosa, French Indochina, and southern China. But Admiral Halsey had concluded that Japanese shipping in the South China Sea represented too lucrative a target to ignore. Intelligence estimated 60 to 80 tankers and cargo ships moving oil from the Dutch East Indies to Japan every month, sailing routes they believed were beyond American carrier range. Those ships sustained Japan's war economy, feeding fuel to aircraft and ships that continued fighting despite overwhelming Allied advantages. Halsey planned to shatter that supply line in a single devastating raid. Task Force 38 would strike targets throughout the region on January 12, sinking everything they could find, then withdraw before Japanese land-based air could organize effective counterattacks. The operation's success depended entirely on surprise. If Japanese aircraft located the task force while it crossed the South China Sea, hundreds of bombers could attack from multiple directions, overwhelming defensive capabilities. The fast carrier task force was powerful but not invincible. Concentrated attacks by land-based aircraft had sunk carriers before, would sink carriers again if given the opportunity. Independence's night fighters became essential to maintaining surprise. They flew continuous patrols over Formosa and Luzon, destroying Japanese reconnaissance aircraft before they could report the task force's position. They intercepted night search planes attempting to locate American ships under cover of darkness. Most importantly, they attacked airfields at dawn, catching Japanese aircraft before they could launch search missions. On the night of January 9th, Lieutenant Commander Caldwell led a 6-aircraft division over Takao Harbor in southern Formosa. His mission: destroy Japanese reconnaissance seaplanes preparing for dawn search missions. The big Kawanishi H-8K flying boats were already being moved to their launching positions, ground crews fueling them for flights that would sweep the Philippine Sea searching for American carriers. Caldwell approached from the east at 8,000 feet, timing his attack for 05:45, 15 minutes before official sunrise. The harbour was just visible in the pre-dawn twilight, lights from the city reflecting off calm water. He could see 7 flying boats moored at buoys, their enormous wings spanning 124 feet. He rolled inverted and pulled through, diving at 70 degrees toward the harbour. His Hellcat accelerated past 400 miles per hour as he descended, controls stiffening as airspeed built. At 2,000 feet, he rolled wings level, lined up on the nearest flying boat, and opened fire. His .50 caliber rounds struck the H-8K's center fuselage where fuel tanks clustered. The flying boat exploded with such violence that Caldwell felt the blast wave rock his aircraft from a quarter-mile away. Burning fuel spread across the water's surface, engulfing 2 more flying boats moored nearby. His wingmen attacked the remaining aircraft with methodical precision. Within 90 seconds, all 7 flying boats burned, their crews abandoning ship, swimming through flaming water toward shore. The reconnaissance mission they would have flown that morning never launched. Task Force 38's position remained secret for another critical day. At 0600 hours on January 12th, Task Force 38 launched the largest carrier strike in the Pacific War to that date. Over 900 aircraft took off from 17 carriers, each assigned specific targets throughout the South China Sea region. The strikes hit Saigon, Cam Ranh Bay, Cap Saint-Jacques, Quy Nhon, and Tourane in French Indochina, attacking shipping, port facilities, and airfields with devastating precision. But the most crucial strikes happened before the main attack, during that twilight hour when Japanese defenders believed themselves safe. Night fighters from Independence swept over airfields near Saigon, destroying 23 Japanese aircraft on the ground before they could launch defensive patrols. The aerial opposition American strike aircraft encountered was minimal, disorganized, and easily overwhelmed. By day's end, 41 Japanese ships lay sunk throughout the region, 31 more heavily damaged. 112 aircraft destroyed on the ground or water, oil storage tanks burning at every major port. The South China Sea shipping route was effectively closed, forcing Japanese tankers to take longer routes that burned more fuel, carried less cargo, arrived later. Robert Sherrod, a Time magazine correspondent flying as an observer with Essex's Air Group, wrote, "By any accounting, January 12, 1945, must be regarded as one of the great days of the United States Navy. But the operation's success rested on Independence's night fighters catching Japanese aircraft before they could organize. The dawn strikes, launched in twilight, had prevented defensive responses that might have cost dozens of American aircraft and pilots. The gap between darkness and full daylight, once neutral territory, now belonged entirely to American carriers. The Japanese Navy realized too late what had happened. Their shipping losses in January exceeded 50% of all cargo moving from Southeast Asia to Japan. Fuel supplies critical to aircraft operations, naval movements, and ground forces began running short. The stranglehold tightened. February 16, 1945. Task Force 58 launched the first carrier strikes against the Japanese home islands since the Doolittle raid in 1942. The target was Tokyo, but Admiral Mitcher understood that attacking Japan itself required neutralizing airfields first, preventing Japanese aircraft from launching coordinated counterattacks against his carriers. He ordered dawn fighter sweeps beginning at 0500 hours, an hour before official sunrise, catching Japanese aircraft on the ground when their pilots believed carriers were still too far away to attack. The tactic worked perfectly. American Hellcats swept over airfields around Tokyo, destroying aircraft in their revetments, shooting up hangars, killing ground crews. By the time sunrise arrived and Japanese commanders ordered defensive launches, many of their aircraft were already burning. The survivors faced American fighters with altitude advantage, radar guidance, and tactical coordination that overwhelmed individual Japanese courage. If you find this story engaging, Please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The February strikes destroyed 341 Japanese aircraft in the air and 190 on the ground. American losses totaled 80 aircraft to all causes. Remarkably light considering the raids represented the first major attack on Japan's heartland. The kill ratio favored Americans by more than 6-1, but success came at a cost, Independence's crew understood intimately. Continuous night operations meant no rest for pilots or deck crews. Launch aircraft at 0400, recover at 0600, launch again at 2200 for night patrols, recover at 0200, maintain continuous readiness, repeat daily. Lieutenant Commander Caldwell flew 87 combat missions between December 1944 and March 1945, more sorties than any other pilot in the Pacific Theater during that period. His division destroyed 63 Japanese aircraft, the majority on the ground during dawn attacks. But exhaustion became a more dangerous enemy than flak or enemy fighters. On March 4th, one of Caldwell's wingmen crashed into the ocean while returning from a night patrol, simply falling asleep at the controls at 8,000 feet, his aircraft descending into the water before he woke. Destroyers recovered his body 3 hours later. The pilot was 22 years old, had been flying continuous combat operations for 11 weeks, averaged 4 hours of sleep per day. The Navy's response was to rotate Independence back to Pearl Harbor for rest and refit, replacing her with Enterprise and Saratoga in the night carrier role. But the operational tempo didn't decrease. By April 1945, during the Okinawa campaign, night carriers were launching continuous strikes to prevent kamikaze attacks during twilight hours, when suicide aircraft achieved their highest success rates. The dawn had become a battlefield as contested as any daytime engagement. Japanese commanders recognized that American carriers launching pre-dawn strikes represented their most vulnerable moment for organizing defenses. They positioned night fighters, concentrated anti-aircraft weapons, and created early warning networks specifically to counter American twilight attacks. But the fundamental problem remained unsolvable. American radar allowed them to see in darkness. American training prepared pilots for instrument flying. American industrial capacity produced enough aircraft to sustain continuous operations that Japanese manufacturing could never match. Commander Genda, now based at Kanoya Air Base on Kyushu, watched his remaining forces erode daily. Every dawn brought American fighters sweeping over his airfields. Every aircraft he lost meant one fewer available for the decisive battle he knew was coming. The mathematics were crushing, undeniable. On April 6, 1945, Genda launched Operation Kikusui, a massive kamikaze attack involving 355 aircraft targeting American ships off Okinawa. The attack required perfect coordination: launch at dawn, form up at sea, approach targets during mid-morning when defensive patrols were lightest. But American night fighters from Enterprise were waiting overhead in darkness. They intercepted Japanese aircraft as they formed up, destroying 47 kamikazes before they could organize into attack formations. The survivors faced continuous fighter opposition throughout their approach, additional losses that shattered unit cohesion. Of 355 aircraft launched, only 76 reached American ships. They sank 3 vessels and damaged 6 more, significant casualties but far less than Genda had planned. The operation that should have devastated the American fleet instead became another demonstration of how completely American night operations had closed the defensive gaps Japan needed to exploit. Genda's after-action report was brutally honest. The enemy has eliminated our advantage during hours of limited visibility. Their carriers operate continuously. Their fighters attack during dawn when our aircraft are most vulnerable. We cannot defend against capabilities we cannot match. May 10, 1945. Commander Turner Caldwell landed aboard USS Hornet after his final combat mission, a dawn strike against airfields near Kagoshima. He'd been flying continuously since December, accumulated 203 combat hours, destroyed or damaged 91 enemy aircraft, and survived when statistics said he should have died. His hands shook constantly now, fatigue so deep that alcohol couldn't touch it. He'd watched 7 men from his division die. Good pilots killed not by enemy action but by operational exhaustion, falling asleep at controls, misjudging approaches in darkness, simply running out of the reserves that kept humans functioning under sustained stress. The night carrier program had proven its concept completely. American forces now owned the twilight, the dawn, the darkness. Japanese aircraft couldn't operate safely during any hours. The defensive gaps that might have changed the war's outcome had closed permanently, but the cost for men was terrible. Navy doctors examining night fighter pilots in June 1945 found average fatigue levels equivalent to sustained combat for 6 months without break. Reaction times slowed, decision-making became impaired. Physical deterioration became evident even in men in their 20s. The program's success had created a trap. It worked so well that commanders couldn't justify stopping it. Every night that carriers didn't fly continuous operations meant gaps Japanese aircraft might exploit. Every dawn attack meant enemy aircraft that survived to attack American ships. The tactical advantage was undeniable, but the human cost was unsustainable. July 10, 1945. Task Force 38 launched strikes against airfields in northern Honshu, the northernmost island of Japan. The war was clearly ending, Japanese resistance collapsing under the combined weight of strategic bombing, naval blockade, and the advancing Soviet army in Manchuria. Yet the dawn strikes continued, American fighters sweeping over airfields at first light, destroying aircraft that would never fly combat missions, killing ground crews who'd already lost the war. Lieutenant Commander William Patterson, who'd taken command of Independence's Night Air Group after Caldwell rotated home, questioned the necessity during the morning briefing. The Japanese have stopped mounting organized resistance. Their fuel is exhausted. Are we just killing for the sake of killing? Captain James Whitfield, Independence's commanding officer, had fought through 3 years of Pacific combat, watched hundreds of men die, and carried scars both visible and hidden. He understood Patterson's moral exhaustion, shared it more than he could admit, but his orders were clear. We continued operations until the Japanese surrendered. Every aircraft they possess represents potential kamikazes. Every airfield we strike means fewer threats against American forces. We finished the job. The strikes continued through August 9th, when the second atomic bomb fell on Nagasaki and the Emperor finally ordered surrender. Independence's night fighters flew their final combat mission on August 14th, a dawn sweep over Hokkaido airfields that destroyed 7 Japanese aircraft and killed 12 ground crew members who died never knowing the war had ended. Total casualties from night carrier operations during the war's final 8 months: 83 American pilots killed, 27 aircraft lost to operational causes, 16 lost to enemy action. Japanese losses during the same period: over 2,000 aircraft destroyed primarily during dawn attacks, countless ground personnel killed, strategic capability eroded until resistance became impossible. The program had accomplished everything the Navy demanded: closed defensive gaps, provided continuous air coverage, destroyed enemy aircraft before they could threaten American forces, changed the fundamental nature of carrier warfare from daylight-only operations to around-the-clock capability that no enemy could escape. But in July 1946, when Commander Caldwell received the Navy Cross for his service, he stood at the ceremony in Pearl Harbor and couldn't remember why the medal mattered. The men who died were still dead. The missions flown couldn't be unflown. The costs remained, permanent, irreversible. That night he sat in the officers' club, drinking whiskey that didn't help, surrounded by pilots celebrating victories that felt increasingly hollow. Someone asked him about the night fighting program, whether he was proud of what they'd accomplished. Caldwell stared at his glass for a long moment before answering. We proved carriers could fight in darkness, proved American technology and training could overcome any defensive advantage the Japanese possessed, proved we could adapt faster than they could respond. He paused, remembering dawn attacks over Philippine airfields, Japanese aircraft burning before their pilots could reach them, ground crews dying at their posts. And we proved that wars aren't won by honor or courage. They're won by whoever can sustain, operational tempo longest, who can keep killing when their own people are exhausted beyond endurance. The room went silent. These were men who'd flown combat missions, understood what Caldwell wasn't saying. The night carrier program had worked perfectly, exactly as designed. That was its tragedy, because once you demonstrated capability, you couldn't stop using it. Couldn't admit the human cost outweighed tactical advantage. Couldn't acknowledge that some victories destroy the men who achieve them. Commander Minoru Genda survived the war, surrendered at Kanoya Air Base on August 15th, alongside 400 aircraft that would never fly again. American intelligence officers interrogated him extensively about Japanese night fighting capabilities, defensive doctrines, and tactical responses to American operations. His answers were precise, professional, devastating. You developed capabilities we couldn't match. Our pilots weren't trained for night operations. Our radar was inadequate. Our industrial capacity couldn't sustain continuous manufacturing necessary to replace losses. From December 1944 onward, we knew the war was lost. Your carriers attacking at dawn simply accelerated the inevitable conclusion. When asked if Japanese forces could have developed counter-tactics, Genda smiled without humor. Counter-tactics require resources we don't possess. Your night carriers operated continuously because you had fuel, replacement aircraft, trained pilots. We had courage, which proved insufficient. Mathematics was always against us. Your dawn attacks simply made those mathematics visible. The interrogation report ended with Genda's final observation. Naval warfare changed fundamentally during the final year of the Pacific War. Carriers became capable of continuous operations that no shore-based force could match. Darkness no longer provided protection. Dawn belonged to whoever controlled the technology and trained personnel necessary to exploit it. Japan lost that race before it truly began. December 14th, 1950. 6 years after independence launched her first night fighters, Commander William Turner Caldwell attended a ceremony at Annapolis where the Navy formally recognized the night carrier program's contribution to victory. Admirals spoke about innovation, adaptation, and tactical superiority. None mentioned the 83 pilots who died, the operational exhaustion that had crippled survivors, the moral costs of destroying enemy forces who'd already lost the capability to resist meaningfully. Caldwell stood at the back of the ceremony hall, watching young midshipmen take notes, learn lessons about carrier warfare and night operations that would shape their careers. They saw victories. He saw Lieutenant Morrison falling asleep at controls and disappearing into the Pacific, saw Japanese ground crews burning at Clark Field, saw his own hands shaking from fatigue so deep it took years to heal. After the ceremony, a young ensign approached him, eager and earnest. "Sir, I'm assigned to Night Attack Squadron 154. We're training on the new F4U5N Corsairs, all-weather fighters based on wartime night operations. Your tactics manual is our textbook." Caldwell looked at the ensign, saw himself at 27, before the missions that defined and destroyed him. "What do you want to know?" The ensign hesitated, then asked, "Was it worth it? The night operations, the costs, everything you accomplished?" Caldwell was silent for a long moment. The ceremony continued around them, admirals discussing future carrier designs, jet aircraft capabilities, Cold War preparedness. Eventually he answered, "We closed the gap. That's what the Navy needed. American carriers could operate continuously, attack at any hour, destroy enemies before they could threaten us. It changed warfare fundamentally. That's not what I asked, sir." "No," Caldwell admitted quietly. "It's not." He walked away without elaborating, leaving the young ensign standing in Annapolis's Memorial Hall, surrounded by plaques honoring victories that the men who'd achieved them couldn't celebrate. The night carrier program had worked exactly as designed, proved its tactical concepts completely, demonstrated American technological and operational superiority. But 6 years after the war's end, Caldwell still couldn't sleep through the night without seeing dawn breaking over Philippine airfields, Japanese aircraft burning before their pilots could reach them, the twilight hour when darkness surrendered to light and men died, never seeing what killed them. The Japanese had believed dawn provided safety. They'd been wrong. American carriers had eliminated that sanctuary, closed the defensive gaps, proved that modern warfare offered no respite, no protected hours, no escape from enemies who could see in darkness and attack during the brief window between night and day. And that capability, once demonstrated, could never be undone. Every carrier that followed would operate continuously. Every future conflict would exploit the twilight. The lessons independence taught in 1944 had become permanent features of naval warfare, costs and all. Commander Minoru Genda returned to Japan's self-defense forces after the occupation ended, helping rebuild an air force focused on defending rather than conquering. When American officers asked him about the Pacific War's lessons, he always returned to the same point. Your night carriers proved that technological advantage, properly exploited, creates insurmountable operational disparities. We couldn't match your capabilities because we lacked your industrial base, your training infrastructure, your ability to sustain operations indefinitely. The dawn attacks demonstrated this more clearly than any daylight battle. In 1960, during a joint military exercise, Genda met Caldwell again. Both men had aged beyond their years, carried scars that no medal could acknowledge. They spoke briefly about tactics, doctrine, the evolution of carrier warfare. Neither mentioned the men who died, proving concepts that became standard operations. As they parted, Genda said quietly, "Your pilots were very effective. They owned the night completely." Caldwell nodded, unable to explain that owning something didn't mean you wanted it, that tactical superiority came at prices that never appeared in after-action reports, that wars were won by men who kept fighting after they'd lost the ability to feel anything but exhaustion. The dawn had belonged to American carriers. That achievement had helped end the war, saved lives by preventing Japanese attacks during vulnerable hours, demonstrated operational capabilities that shaped naval warfare for generations. But standing in Tokyo in 1960, watching the sun rise over a rebuilt city, Caldwell couldn't shake the memory of that first dawn attack over Clark Field, Japanese aircraft burning in the twilight, the terrible beauty of tracer fire arcing through semi-darkness, the moment he'd understood that some advantages destroy the men who wield them as thoroughly as they destroy enemies. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.